evening and welcome to the first of two Inside Governments for the fall 27. Okay. So, this is going to be on me.
Okay.
That's a Good evening and welcome to the first of two Inside Governments for the fall 2019 semester here at CU Community College and broadcast on Spectrum, Verizon, Fios, the Auburn Regional Media Access, better known as ARMA, and WDNR, the college's radio station 89.1. I'm your host, Guy Cosentino. In about 45 days, the New York State Legislature will return to Albany for matters before the state and start discussing, approving, or rejecting the budget for 2021 that will be presented by the governor. Since June, the legislature has been out of session, but since then, that does not mean that our next guest has not done a great deal of work in her district on behalf of her constituents. Senator Pamela Helming, a Republican, represents the 54th Senate District that includes portions of CU County. We were talking about the lines just before we came on, as well as parts of Ontario, Seneca, and Wayne counties. Elected 3 years ago, she is starting her second year of her second term. She's the ranking member of the Rural Resources Committee of the State Senate, as well as serving on several other Senate committees, which we'll talk about in a bit. We've asked the Senator to come in to talk about Albany, give us an update since the last time she was here, which is about 10 months ago. There's been a number of items on her plate, including flooding in northern CU County, the budget that just passed, the upcoming budget that will be presented, and what is going to go on in the legislative session. And we might even talk about her plans for November of next year. Welcome back.
Thank you, Guy. It's wonderful to be here.
So let's set aside issues for a second. New addition to your family?
Absolutely. I have a granddaughter who's 8 months old now.
First granddaughter?
First grandchild.
Oh, great. Do you get to see her at all?
I get to see her once a month or so. My granddaughter, my daughter, and my son-in-law are down near Fort Bragg. My son-in-law is a Green Beret in the Army.
Okay, so and you'll see each other for Thanksgiving, you said beforehand.
Absolutely.
That's
Thanksgiving
good.
and Christmas.
And Christmas.
Yeah,
that's what every grandmother or grandfather, as I'm told, wants.
Absolutely.
They don't care about the kids anymore, but
yeah.
Hey, the grandchild's always important.
Yeah.
We also said we would talk about, you have a little bit of bandage there. If it was for me, it was because I was not paying attention shaving again. Something different for you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to make this public service announcement. What I'd like to share with everyone is, hey, use your sunscreen. Use it year-round and get regular checkups. That's what I just had, a regular checkup. Had to have a little something removed, and everything fine, but
Good.
Wear your sunscreen.
You might not need it for the next 6 months, God knows here, unless you're in Florida or North Carolina. So obviously the legislative session ended at the end of June. That does not mean that you just shut down and you go back to whatever you were doing before. You still work for constituents and do other events, and I know you've had a number of them since June. What have you been doing in the interim?
So since session ended at the end of June, I have been very busy traveling around the 6 counties that I represent, holding mobile office hours. So mobile office hours, I do a couple every single month. I'm in every corner of the district. I go out to sites and people come in to meet with me. It's a great opportunity for me to get feedback from community members, from elected officials, from business owners, and just citizens who want to share their concerns about state government. I utilize then all that information they share with me to help them make changes for their community and or for when I go back to Albany to make legislative changes to help the community.
So I know there's some specific things we'll talk about. There's been bail reform and some other things we'll get into much deeper. What in general do they talk to you about?
In general, like I'll use the 2 Cayuga County mobile offices that I held. I held one in the north end of the county up in Sterling, and the other one was down in Venice. And I'd have to say the number one concern I hear from people is about taxes. That New York State is just not an affordable state. And that these people have lived here all their lives, their families are here, they don't want to have to leave. So they're asking me to continue doing everything that I can to push back on new taxes and fees. And that has always been a priority for me. In 2017 and in 2018, during the budget sessions, we pushed back on over $1 million in new taxes and fees. So that's one concern. And then in Sterling, there were a lot of issues around the lake, the flooding of Lake Ontario. And in the southern area, questions regarding agriculture, the impact of the new legislation that was passed, the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Act, it's called, the impact that's going to have.
So for those who don't know that changes the labor game in agriculture dramatically.
Right.
And that had not passed previously when the Republicans had control of the Senate.
Right.
Am I correct on that?
That is absolutely correct.
All right. So what does that require now?
So that there is mandatory overtime to be paid to farm workers. And it also, I think what's most concerning to farmers is the fact that it creates a labor board that will be meeting fairly soon, I believe it's in March, to determine whether or not overtime should be paid for less than 60 hours per week.
So there are these boards and commissions. This is a more global New York State issue because it came up with the issue of tipping, I believe, and it was almost a pro forma. The governor said, well, we're going to send it to a commission. I'm summarizing, if I'm wrong, correct me. But we're going to send it to a commission, and basically the commission rubber stamped what he was proposing. Is that how this commission would work as well? There's also been this issue of the tiered minimum wage, and I know New York upstate and New York downstate are two different tiers, but there's been this, you throw it to a commission that's appointed official. They did it with pay for the legislature. Is that become the norm now?
I think that does become the norm. In terms of the agricultural commission that's been formed, what's really, really distressing is that it's a 3-member board, and 2 of the members have already come out and said that they support paying overtime after 40 hours
So
are
they haven't
worked.
even had a hearing.
So they haven't even had a hearing. 2 out of the 3 members have said that they're in favor of reducing the overtime requirements, and all they have to do is get together and that will happen. I think
Who appoints them?
The appointments, I believe, it's by statute.
Okay.
This particular commission, it's spelled out who will be on the board. But right now, I guess what is really concerning to me is the commission that's been appointed by the governor and the other leaders of the Senate and the Assembly to study public financing of campaigns. And I'm waiting to hear what the commission is going to recommend. It's very distressing because I'm an elected official, my colleagues are elected officials, and state government, instead of putting the responsibility on elected officials to make decisions and provide the transparency and accountability that goes along with us making those decisions, they're using these appointed commissions, typically appointed by, well, they're appointed by our one-party leaders. And this Public Finance Commission will be making recommendations on using taxpayer dollars to finance elections.
And the legislature would have to override those recommendations, or otherwise they would go into effect. Am I
They'll
correct?
automatically go into effect.
And there is public financing in New York City already, and there's been criticism.
Yep.
I know the last time one of your colleagues, when he ran, Mr. Antonacci, who has served in the Senate for a very short period of time and is leaving you in about 45 days,
Right.
he, I don't think, qualified for public financing when he ran, but Mr. Napoli did. Am I correct on that?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
So, so with all of that, I want to go back to this tax issue. So you just had a budget before you a couple of months ago. Good budget, bad budget?
I think it was a terrible budget.
So did you vote against it?
I voted against the budget.
So what was bad in the budget?
There were so many things that were bad in it. All the new taxes and fees that were hidden in the budget. And again, Guy, I think we've talked about this in the past. What's really distressing about the budgets year after year after year is the amount of policy that's incorporated into the budget. That is the governor's way to, I believe, circumvent the legislature or to have open discussions. And I think the greatest example of that, it's a travesty, is this new bail reform. That was built into the budget, passed through the budget.
So I want to get to bail reform. I want to just finish up on the budget because you mentioned some things on there. Was there anything in the budget you did like?
I did like that in 2017, my first year in the Senate, we put records amount of funding into the Environmental Protection Fund, which really helps us out in this area with so much, with combating the blue-green algae issue, helping farmers with manure storage. So that funding continued in this year's budget. I'm happy to see that.
And Dr. Adam Epfler will be here in just a few minutes. He's going to be talking about Owasco Lake, so that will
great,
come up with him as well.
I am disappointed, though. I do want to say, with the amount of funding, also that was included for infrastructure, whether we're talking about roads, bridges, culverts, or broadband services. There just wasn't adequate funding. I know for a number of years now, our cities have been asking for an increase with the arterial maintenance
So
funding.
the governor vetoed that this week. So
He vetoed that for Auburn.
So did he veto just for Auburn or for all municipalities?
For all municipalities. It's been a decade since they've had an increase.
Decade or decades? Because if I remember correctly, it goes back to the 1980s was the last real increase they've done. They do it on a per square foot on
Yes.
their, and it's a state road.
Yep.
The city has to maintain it, but they haven't been reimbursed nearly what it cost. Am I correct on that?
Right, and when you look at the cost over the time, whether it's been a decade or decades, the cost of fuel, salt, equipment maintenance, it's ridiculous that we push this. It's another burden, financial burden on our local governments.
Well, and not to go back in time, but I remember when we were in the New York Conference of Mayors, it was just a couple of years previous to that, revenue sharing which is mandated in the Constitution. The current governor's father eliminated most of that, and that's where cities have not ever caught up. Forget school districts for a second. But speaking of school districts, how did schools make out in your district overall, and what's the outlook, especially for Auburn, which is part of your district, and they have had a distressed budget because of the whole formula issue?
Right. So I think when it comes to the schools in my district, most of them are relatively happy. All of them, of course, would like additional funding. But I've really only heard from maybe 2 or 3 school districts about specific issues. And what's interesting, you mentioned the school-based funding formula. I could have one district talking to me about one piece of the formula that should be changed, and the second school district who feels like they're shorted will be telling me, don't touch that piece, we need this piece changed.
Right.
So recently I've attended a number of public hearings across the state. There was one in Syracuse I attended where we talked about the funding formula and what needs to happen. I think Auburn has some unique circumstances surrounding it. I think they're a high needs district and they're currently being funded as a low needs district. I was able to get them some additional funding in last year's budget. I was also able to get them some grant funding to help with building improvements that they wanted to make. But they're a unique situation.
Do you think it changes this coming year? Because this is a zero-sum game to a certain degree, in my view, because you have to either change everybody and everybody has to go up. Because if you start tinkering with one district, somebody else is going to complain that you either took money from them if you change the formula. It's almost that you have to infuse with billions more into the system to fix it.
I hope there's a way to come up with a fair funding formula. I think that's going to be extremely challenging. But I believe with all my heart and soul that it's time to take politics out of educational funding. We've got to look at how much we're spending on our schools, what the outcome is, how are our kids doing in terms of getting jobs, going on to college. We've got to come up with some accountability measures on are we getting what we paid for? And also when we look at the schools across the board, I know Auburn always compares themselves to other Cayuga County schools and feel they get a disproportionate share. But we've got to look at, too, how can we do it better?
So this month was an election month. We had early voting. We're the 38th state to finally get to that level. Do you think it was a success?
I think I need to study the data a little bit more before I can answer that question. So I heard a lot of positive comments from people saying, oh, this is great that I could stop by any time and vote, or it's great that I don't need a reason to do an absentee ballot. But I know I've looked at one county so far, Ontario, and it's sort of suggesting that the people who came out early and voted, those are people who vote anyway. So for me, the question is, did we capture any new...
Do you think there's a lot of data slicing that needs to be done?
Yes.
So the other 2 pieces for communities that they've asked, one is, in Cayuga County is a perfect example. We didn't decide the city council race until 2 days ago. It's now taking even longer to count absentees. Is that because of the legislation?
It shouldn't be because of the legislation, because as far as I know, the cutoff date for receiving ballots is the same. That hasn't
Shouldn't
changed.
they have moved that back? If they were going to do early balloting, just say it's election day, and when they got to be in by election day. You could mail them on, the Friday before, and once they get here, they're there. But isn't there a cutoff? That's almost 11 days, almost 2 weeks from election day. And for some candidates, I've never had that problem. It's either big or either big win or big loss. Shouldn't candidates get to know instead of being trailed out for 2 weeks?
It would be nice. And I think it would save everyone, including the taxpayers, dollars if we were able to do that. But I have to say, when it comes to early voting, when it comes to voting in general, I just wish we could get people out to vote. I don't know that early voting has accomplished that. I think we keep making all these concessions, but at what cost, and how has it impacted the results?
So the last question on before getting to bail reform is on elections has been, will counties be covered for future costs and cost stuff? For example, in Cuyahoga County, as you know, Conquest, Venice, and Auburn were all voting sites.
Yes.
We only had to have one. There's a concern that in the future that funding won't be in place. Do you think the funding will be in place for communities like Cuyahoga?
I think it absolutely has to be in place if it's going to be a mandate. And I will say this time and time again, the state should quit passing down unfunded mandates. And if it's important for communities that are large in geographical size, like Cuyahoga County, if it's important to have a voting...
A long, narrow county versus...
A site, central, northern, and southern ends, then the state should cover that cost.
So a lot of attention has been, especially since Election Day, because I think Election Day kind of sucked out some of the air on state policy, has been about this issue of bail reform that goes into effect effectively in the new year.
Yes.
First of all, give us a global, what is it, whether you're for it or against it, what's it doing?
So the bail reform that was included in the New York State budget, put there by Governor Cuomo, it essentially ends cash bail. It creates what I would call a catch and release program for...
When you say cash bail, what does that mean? For the general viewer, what does cash bail mean?
So cash bail means when you're arrested for something, say it's a criminal possession of heroin or some drug, and you're typically arrested and arraigned and asked to post bail until your court date. And you could be detained in jail until your court date. It eliminates the court's ability to set bail for certain crimes, for nonviolent offenses, nonviolent felonies, and misdemeanors.
So this basically deals, bail bondsmen for the most part go away then in this whole process.
Yes, yeah.
So...
But more significant than bail bondsmen going away is the fact that we're going to have criminals walking our streets. In New York City alone, it's estimated that before the end of the year, 200,000 currently incarcerated individuals will be released. Here in Cuyahoga County, that number is...
So even those who were under the old system will be released because the new rules go in effect, and they'll go backwards.
Yes, yes.
So I'm taken from your tone. Give me a hint if I'm wrong. You're not very supportive of this.
I am not supportive of this at all.
So, what is law enforcement? I know Sheriff Skank was on here on Tuesday. I know he wrote a column, oddly enough, that same day about bail reform. We did not get to talk about it at that point. What's local law enforcement telling you?
So I have talked to local law enforcement, court administrators, our DAs for months now about this issue. But just last week held a press conference with Cuyahoga County Sheriff Brian Skank, the DA, John Boodleman, and also DAs from across my district, sheriffs from across my district, local police chiefs, NYSCOBA, and so many people who are in the criminal justice system. That's their field. And what they're saying is, look, we would all support some common sense changes to the current system. There's no question that we need to make some changes. But what has been done, these sweeping, dramatic changes, they're not the answer. And they're not the answer for a number of reasons, primarily because it jeopardizes public safety.
Do you see any chance of changes in the new session?
There have been at least 4 pieces of legislation that have been introduced over the last couple of weeks. I co-sponsor every single one of them. Basically, one would repeal this law. The other 3 would return some of the ability of the court administration to make decisions, decide whether or not bail is warranted based on the circumstances regarding the case. That's how I believe it should be. Another thing I'm going to go back to is that this legislation was passed in the budget. So our district's attorneys weren't consulted about it. Our law enforcement officials were not consulted about it. When we're talking about making dramatic changes like this, we should have input from people from across New York State, across the state. We shouldn't be focused on what our New York City needs. It should be this law impacts everyone across the state. Everyone across the state should be given ample opportunity to provide.
But when you say New York City consulted, it was New York City legislators who wanted this, not necessarily New York State law enforcement, New York City law enforcement.
New York City legislators who were the strong
supporters of it.
Yeah.
So another change that occurred, I think it's called the Green Light Bill in licensing, and I know there's not necessarily, there may be a connection, but not necessarily a connection. There was a hit and run in Weedsport in the northern part of Cuyahoga County with an illegal alien, someone who has been accused of being an illegal alien. Or not in the country legally after being sent out before. What happened with the green light? Was that approved where undocumented workers can get licenses now?
Yes, that was passed by the New York State Legislature. It was signed into law by Governor Cuomo. I did not support that legislation. There is not another state in this nation that has a green light law similar to what New York did. There are so many potential consequences to that law. But one thing I just want to go back to the cashless bail for a moment, because based on some social media reports I'm reading, some editorials I'm seeing, I think that people are misled by the title that this cashless bail impacts only misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. But the offenses that fall under that criteria are much more serious than those names would imply. So to someone who's reading that there have been changes for misdemeanors, they're thinking, good, so what? What's the big deal? But if you read the law, you read the legislation, you're going to see the long list: manslaughter, aggravated vehicular homicide, rape in the 3rd degree, burglary, robbery, terrorist threats.
So some of these are violent.
Yeah. How about promotion of obscene performances by a child? It's disgusting. It's disgusting. So those who are alleged of committing these crimes are going to be basically issued an appearance ticket and set free. They're going to go right back onto the streets. Do you think that drug dealers and others are going to hang around until their court date and just show up when they don't have bail on the line? Absolutely not.
So just real quick, we got about 5 minutes, so a couple of quick items. One is the flooding up in the northern part of your district. What is going on there? What would you like to see the state do? And more importantly, what would you like to see the federal government do?
Okay. Yeah. So from a state perspective, I'm very proud of the response that we've had in 2019. We have been able to secure funding to help out some of our small businesses and our homeowners. To me, I think it's time for the IJC to step, it's beyond time, past time for the IJC to step up and take responsibility. Their job is to manage lake levels, and they're not managing it, which is why we're having the flooding. I'm extremely concerned because right now the lake levels are so high, which leads me and many others to suspect that in 2020, the flooding is going to be worse than it ever was in 2017 or 2019. So I'd like to see the IJC step up. I'm glad the state of New York is suing the IJC, and again, I'm here
until they change their policy, you don't see this mitigated?
I don't. I see some of the projects being done by the state. We secured, for instance, almost $15 million for Cuyahoga County for mitigation measures, resiliency protections. I think that's important to continue to do because I don't see the lake levels dropping.
So 45 days you go back. What's your top priorities?
No new taxes or fees. Continue to fight back and push back on that. Listen, I want families to be able to stay in New York State. My family and I, we love New York State. Like I told you, my daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter are in North Carolina because my son-in-law's in the military, but their goal is to come back to New York State. I want to have a strong state where people can afford to live, where there are job opportunities available, where the educational system is top in the nation.
So there's going to be some changes very few changes in the Republican conference. Do you see any of your committee assignments changing at this stage?
I do not, no.
So one of your colleagues, we mentioned him early on, Bob Antonacci, won a judgeship 2 weeks ago. He's going to be leaving. He represents the upper eastern part of Cuyahoga County, because Senator Stewart has the lower part of Cuyahoga, and you have the west. What is the process for replacing Senator Antonacci?
I believe the governor, it's up to him to call a special election.
So he doesn't get to appoint a member of the Senate.
No.
So
the public will choose.
And is there any requirement? I know before we were talking, I just had seen a news lead that said that former Mayor Lattimore was thinking of running and tossing his hat. Is there any requirements of being a state senator? A residency, or you just have to be a New York State voter, or it's fairly loose?
That's something that I'll have to look into.
Okay.
I would assume you would want to be a resident of the district that you're representing. I couldn't imagine living outside of my district.
So you were here a couple weeks ago with the Downtown Revitalization Initiative funding. You also had the Village of Seneca Falls, just got $10 million. Mm-hmm. Is Downtown Revitalization Initiative, is that on the economic development front working as far as you're concerned?
I would say yes, and point to Geneva as an example. I'm very excited about some of the projects that are on the Auburn list, increasing the public safety, the improvements that are going to be made there. I think that is tremendous. I think the Nix Ride program is the funding that they're going to receive and what they're going to be able to do with that to provide additional services to those who are addicts. I think that's so desperately needed, and I think it's a great win. And it's very cool, if I can use that word, to see Auburn on the 5 and 20 corridor, if you will, receiving the DRI money, Seneca Falls and Geneva. That is going to have a huge positive impact on our region from an economic
and
standpoint.
tourism point of view.
Yes, yep.
So just a couple quick political questions, because part of the problem we have now is with the new election law, and you all have to fill out petitions in February. We can't have you on because we have chosen for the last 20 years. If you're a candidate, you can't be on. But I do know one of your former colleagues, Senator John DeFrancisco, has written a new book. Yeah. Have you or your staff looked at it at all?
Oh, absolutely. So many of my staff members, my colleagues, and others have read the book, and they call up all excited when they read something that is exciting or maybe a bit controversial.
Or positive about you.
Or positive, yeah. That was the first thing I heard. It's all positive about you. I think the statement was something related to, had I been in office when Senator DeFrancisco ran for the GOP leader conference, that he would have been elected.
The census is coming up. We had the census representatives a couple of weeks ago. Are you doing anything on that front to help increase reporting so that people do file the paperwork or do the surveys that haven't gone out yet?
My constituent surveys, yes. They're available online right now, and also we're doing a mailing to people. That's something that I do every year, constituent survey.
But you will also be encouraging people to fill out their census.
Census, yes.
I'm sorry.
I missed the beginning.
Survey. I should.
Yeah, it's important that everyone be counted.
So it is a couple months away. Have you decided whether you'll seek re-election or not?
It is a couple months away, but I am absolutely going to run again.
Okay.
There's still so much work that needs to be done. I think it's been a very successful first 2 terms in office. I'll continue to work hard to represent the people in the district.
So there's a lot going on in Washington this week, if you turn on your television, either whether during the day or late night. Do you think the president will have any impact on races like your own and races for Republicans in upstate? I know you have a new party chair. Ed Cox has stepped down, or not. Nick Langworthy is there. Do you think the president will have any impact on races like yours?
I don't think the president will have any impact. Actually, I'm going to take that back. I think in my district, the president and what he's been able to accomplish will have a positive impact in my district.
Okay.
That will probably be different in other areas of New York State. But with everything that's in the news, as you mentioned these last couple of days, look, what I'd like to say is, let's get back to work. let's get back to fixing our roads. Let's get back to dealing with some of the healthcare issues and other issues that we have. There's so much work to be done. Let's put our focus on the positive things that could be done.
Well, I hope you will come back. If you don't have an opponent, you're more than welcome anytime.
Great,
I'm
thank
sure
you.
you're okay with not having an opponent.
Absolutely.
That happened with John DeFrancisco 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
Nice.
We'd love to have you back in the studio for an Albany update. And congratulations on the grandchild again.
Thank you very much, Guy. Thank you.
I hope you have a great many years with her. So
thank you.
Our guest has been Senator Pamela Helming, who joins us for an Albany update today. And we, again, do look forward to having her back in the studio. We'll return in just a moment with a second edition of Inside Government with an Owasco Lake update with Dr. Adam Effler, the Owasco Lake Watershed Management Council's Executive Director. They've got to shorten that title. We will finish our fall 2019 season next Tuesday with former New York State Senator John DeFrancisco talking about his new book, Never Say Never. It is a page-turner and very fun. And then we will also have an update from City Manager Jeff Dygert, and there is no doubt that we will be talking about baseball with him as well. Before we go, though, we would like to let you know that you can send us your questions or thoughts for future guests on Inside Government or Beyond the Front Page. We will be back in the spring. We've already started booking shows for then. You can send us your questions or by email to cozguytho@aol.com or Inside Government, 141 Dunning Avenue, Auburn, New York, 13021. I'm Guy Cosentino for Cuyahoga Community College. I want to thank you for watching. We hope you'll stay around so you can hear about Owasco Lake in just a moment from Dr. Effler.